have a little bit of time, we could break out and do some short sessions.
I have to go take my insulin there.
And see how that works.
Get it and bring it back.
All right. So let's begin the meeting. I want to welcome everyone to another Zoom get together. It looks like it's a relatively beautiful day, just before the relatively not very nice day is coming up. So welcome to our weekly midday meeting of the Rotary Club. I'm Chris Colby, president of the club for 2020-21. The four-way test is, we're going to try again, for those of you who weren't with us last week, we're going to try to do it again the same way. And Joseph is going to lead us in this. What we're going to do with the help of having the prompts on the screen so that we'll have the four-way test is that Joseph will read the first part of the four-way test, and then we will repeat afterward, and then so on through the four different items. So Joseph, you want to start?
Okay, I am ready. So please repeat after me. Of the things we think, say, or do.
Of the
things we think, say, or do.
First, is it the truth?
First
is the truth.
Second, is it fair to all concerned?
Second, is it fair to all concerned?
Third, will it build goodwill and better friendship?
Third, will it build
goodwill,
better
friendship?
Four, will it be beneficial to all concerned?
Fourth,
will it be beneficial to all concerned?
Thank you.
Thank you.
We did it again. We weren't quite as coordinated as last time, but it's better than missing out a couple of items like we have. Next, we have a reflection, and Elizabeth is going to lead us or have a reflection for us.
Okay, some of you who are on Facebook may have seen this, but I thought it was worth sharing with everyone. And this came in a post actually from Betty Devine, who had shared it from someone else. So this is credited to Aaron Avnet. There was a farmer who grew excellent quality corn. Every year he won the award for the best grown corn. One year, a newspaper reporter interviewed him and learned something interesting about how he grew it. The reporter discovered that the farmer shared his seed corn with his neighbors. How can you afford to share your best seed corn with your neighbors when they are entering corn in competition with yours each year? The reporter asked. Why, sir, said the farmer, didn't you know? The wind picks up pollen from the ripening corn and swirls it from field to field. If my neighbors grow inferior corn, cross-pollination will steadily degrade the quality of my corn. If I am to grow good corn, I must help my neighbors grow good corn. So is with our lives. Those who want to live meaningfully and well must help enrich the lives of others, for the value of a life is measured by the lives it touches. And those who choose to be happy must help others find happiness, for the welfare of each is bound up with the welfare of all. Call it power of collectivity, call it a principle of success, call it a law of life. The fact is, none of us truly wins until we all win.
Yes.
Very good.
That's good. Yes.
Very good, very good.
Thank you.
Elizabeth. So I'd like to welcome any visiting guests. I'm looking at the screen, the two screens, and I don't see that we have any visitors. So
we do have a visitor, Chris.
I'm sorry. Who might that be?
Julie, are you willing to introduce yourself and tell us why you're joining us today? Is Julie Anderson still on the call?
Yes, I had to unmute myself. I am Julie Anderson. I'm a visitor today with Dr. Janine Ganganis. I'm currently the Dean of Nursing and Health Sciences at Winona State University, and I'm in Rochester part-time and in Winona part-time, so it's great to be here.
Well,
Welcome, Julie.
glad you're back. Glad you're here.
Thank you.
Visitors, so it's nice to have you on board. Let's see here. I'm looking at my script here. I want to point out a couple of things in the moccasin flower, which hopefully everybody got a chance to read. We've been good about getting that out early in the week for people to catch up on different topics. A couple of things jumped out at me. Number one, Frank Allen's birthday is today. Happy birthday, Frank. I'm not going to, unless Colin is willing to sing, I'm not going to try to sing happy birthday, but happy birthday to you. And Al DeBoer is celebrating this year or this month his 51 years as a Rotarian. I thought that was kind of a milestone and that we all should be aware of. The meeting next week, coming events. Next week, our Rotary Midday Meeting will be a Zoom program, Impact of COVID-19 on Higher Education, presented by Rotarian Janine Gangnes. So we look forward to having that program, and that'll kind of tie into the topic for today's program with Dr. Greg Poland. Monday, let's see, Monday's Holiday Classic Steering Team meeting was canceled because they're waiting for more information from about schools and sports from Governor Walz. I don't know if there's a schedule for that announcement. I think it's any day. He's probably working his way through the decision as well as the politics involved to do this. So our next meeting after next week, Rotary After Hours with Social Distancing, will be August 6th, Thursday, August 6th from 5:30 to 6:30. And Elizabeth sent out a request for people to sign up for hosting this event, and she was pleasantly surprised by how many people actually committed to sponsoring. So that may be a good sign that people are starting to get anxious to get together in small groups, and of course it'll be done with all the social distancing and all the rules that are required with masks and so on. So hopefully we can make that an ongoing event, the first meeting of every month as we go along. So that won't necessarily mean that we can do that out on someone's patio in December and January, but hopefully by then we'll have some venues that we can have these meetings. And by the way, if you want to sign up for that, you'll go to our website and sign up, or go through the link on the next moccasin flower, or call Elizabeth at the Rotary office and she'll take care of getting you signed up. The Rotary golf outing is still a save the date on September 16th out at Willow Creek, and it's an open meeting for all Rotarians and guests that would like to play, and we'll have a short program prior to the golf, and then we'll go out and play golf in the afternoon. So again, if you want to sign up on our club's website for that, we can get that moved along. The last item before we get to our program, and I think we're probably going to be way ahead of things here, so maybe we'll before we get to our maybe having a breakout session. The last meeting we had a very good breakout sessions after or actually prior to the program as well, where we asked people to give some thought and some ideas and brainstorm a little bit on ideas of how we could be of service to different organizations and provide some help and volunteers for different activities within the community. And I think it's safe to say we had a fairly significant number of responses, and Elizabeth is working on putting together kind of compiling those probably 6 or 8 different options that we have, and we're going to review that with the board, the first board meeting, which is August 5th coming up. And so you'll hear more about that, but thank you for being part of that discussion, and hopefully we can come up with some ideas that can help people and give people some opportunities to be of service within our community as Rotarian volunteers. So I assume we haven't heard or anything from Dr. Poland yet. So I guess probably the thing to do here would be to have another breakout session. And Elizabeth had put together a possible conversation that's something a little bit different than we've had in the past, and that was when was the last time you were amazed by yourself, or something you amazed yourself by, or what did you do, or when was the last time someone actually amazed you? What did they do? And so with that topic, let's break out into several chat groups, and maybe someone can in each group try to record or report back when we get maybe 10 or 15 minutes of this discussion back to the group, so we can all share in the feedback.
Okay, and just a friendly reminder that you will need to join your group when I hit the create room. So I'm going to do that now. Thank you.
I am ready. Are we ready with the program, or should I take some time to recap some of the things we heard?
We can recap very briefly, but Dr. Poland is here with us and ready to begin when you're finished.
Okay. Well, with respect to his time, I guess we could do this perhaps at the end if we have time. We can follow up. So I think I think it would be more appropriate to respect Dr. Poland's time and move forward. So Barry, if you want to be unmuted and do the introduction, I'd appreciate it.
Okay, I am ready. And as I was saying, with the current disruption in our lives with what I'm calling COVID-1984, I think today's program is especially pertinent. So it gives me great pleasure to introduce Dr. Gregory Poland. He is a renowned award-winning Mayo Clinic physician whose outstanding bio is so long that I've just kind of highlighting briefly. He holds a named professorship, the Mary Lowell Leary Emeritus Professor of Medicine, and Dr. Poland also holds the academic rank of Professor of Medicine and Infectious Diseases and Molecular Pharmacology and Experimental Therapeutics. He's been honored as the Mayo Clinic Distinguished Investigator, which I can tell you from personal experience is a big deal at Mayo Clinic, and he's editor-in-chief for the journal Vaccine. Dr. Poland has chaired or been a member of every federal committee involved in vaccine decision-making. He's the director of Mayo's Vaccine Research Group, and in fact, it was his lab that developed the field of viral vaccine immunogenetics, among others of its achievements. And he is the foremost expert in this area, and I think we're very fortunate to have him available to present to Rotary today. And on that, Dr. Poland, the screen is yours.
Thank you, Barry, and nice to meet you. I know your husband well, but never had the pleasure of meeting you other than through email. So nice to do so. I've entitled deliberately a provocative title, SARS-CoV-2, a two-edged sword. And the two edges are denials, delays, and dysfunction. And on the other side, unprecedented progress, as we'll talk about. Just some starting thoughts, because I've done a little over 800 national and international interviews now on COVID-2, and you see what's happening in our society. So I thought I'd start with this. You, of course, can have your own opinions, but not your own facts. Science is not a democracy. There are massive political and economic conflicts of interest conflating an effective nationwide response to COVID-19. In my view, the only rational response is evidence-based policies and procedures, at least where we have evidence. And the lack of such a response, as you all know, has cost lives, quality of life, jobs, economic security, an ongoing pandemic, and the education of our children. Well, Albert Camus, writing about a different plague in a different era, said this: they fancied themselves free, and no one will ever be free so long as there are pestilences. And I think all of us cooped up as we've been since February, March timeframe can now identify with that. Well, this is a cartoon of the coronavirus. I know there are a number of scientists in the audience. This is a RNA virus, and I just wanted to point out what I put in red there, the S or spike protein. You will hear a lot about that as you read about coronaviruses. That is the major determinant being used to create vaccines, in addition to the sort of blue-green RNA material there. Now, how do humans get infected? This is going to sound really obvious, but I want you to appreciate the power in this. There are really only two ways: inhaling the virus or touching a contaminated surface and then touching your eyes, nose, or mouth. The reason that's important is because it makes mitigation and prevention of infection much easier. I neglected to say, there may also be an oral fecal route. We know that the virus is shed in stool. We also know that the virus can be isolated from semen. So whether there's actually a sexual transmission or not is currently unclear. I'm going to talk just very briefly about clinical features. These are, in the context of COVID-2, these are old studies back from May, but there are large studies, and I think helpful in that way. This disease severity has not been our own experience here in the US. It's been somewhat less than this. Their case fatality rate was 2.3. You'll see what ours is in a moment. The other thing that has held up, and I think is important, is case fatality by age. These are, of course, population level figures, and so they vary by individual condition, but they have generally held up. And this is really important in terms of thinking about population level strategies for mitigation. The other point I want to make is we are learning every week of just how profound the effect of this virus has been, from unbelievable amounts of large vessel occlusive strokes in young people, something we functionally never see, to cardiac and endocrine and dermatologic, renal, liver, GI, central nervous system effects. They are protean in manifestation. This is important because when you hear about young people saying, well, I'm not going to die or have any kind of severe problem, even mild or asymptomatic infection is not a guarantee against having complications that they may even be unaware of. For example, pulmonary fibrosis or some loss in renal or hepatic function. These, just to expand a little bit on this, the other things that we have certainly learned about is a multi-system inflammatory syndrome in children, thankfully pretty rare, but devastating when it happens. And then more recently, the considerable clotting abnormalities that occur on the venous and arterial side. Mental health issues. My daughter's a mental health specialist, and she's called mental health the actual second wave of the pandemic. And then we are learning more and more about pregnancy issues, particularly for the mother's health. We have at this point absolutely zero understanding of the mid to long-term effects of COVID-19 on a fetus. Now, this has been the really difficult part about managing this pandemic. Unlike SARS and MERS, where people were symptomatic, in this particular virus and COVID-19 disease, a good portion, perhaps 50 to 80% of people might be asymptomatic or minimally symptomatic, so they don't really detect that they're ill. And yet they can have end organ damage. They can transmit the virus to others. And so particularly with younger people, you see the pictures of them crowding onto the beaches and bars and restaurants, sometimes even older people. And it's because they are acting out of ignorance. They think, well, I don't have any symptoms and the people I'm with don't have any symptoms. And that ignorance is not bliss. In this case, ignorance is deadly. The reason for it is what's been called the reproductive number of the virus. And so I've tried to illustrate it there for a R naught of 3. So one person who doesn't realize he or she is sick spreads it to 3 others, and then to 9 others, and then to 27 others. And pretty soon you're up in the tens of thousands, and within a week or two, hundreds of thousands of cases, making it at this point simply impractical to do contact tracing, something that is extraordinarily valuable in the early stages of an epidemic. We are now past that. Here's just one simple example. If you look at the 14 people that ring the gray center, these are 14 family members who decided, you know what, we've been in isolation long enough, we're going to have a little bit of a family gathering. I don't know the details as to whether they wore masks or not, but this is reflective of many such cases we know. And you see the very rapid spread, both within the family, to coworkers, to grandparents, to neighbors, etc., of this virus. So this is not a virus I would ever be tempted to underestimate. And this is what happens. When you look at January 20th, we had 282 known cases. Very quickly, within 10, 11 days, we had 10,000 cases, then 100,000, and then 14 million. This, it's worth staring at this for a moment to understand just how widespread this has occurred. In fact, let me put it this way. Linearity is relatively easy to manage. Exponentiality is very hard to manage. So it took us 3 months in the US to hit 1 million cases, 44 days to double that to 2 million, 26 days to hit 3 million cases, 12 days to hit 4 million. We are now diagnosing new cases at the rate of 60 to 70,000 cases a day. In the last 14 days, cases have increased 30%, deaths have increased 48%. You can look at the state that we live in, or states that you visit or have family in, to get a sense in the last week compared to the previous week, what has happened to case counts. And you realize that it's only in a very few small number of the northeastern states that have taken by law steps to control this, that there's actually been control. For the most part, in the rest of the nation, it is out of control. I happen to be sitting in Florida right now, and I think it's interesting to look back in April and May, where there was a stay-at-home order. That occurred in the context of having about 1,000 cases a day. We are now having 16 to 17,000 cases every day. New cases. Yes, we have done more testing, and people don't understand that there's a lag time behind that, including for deaths. So our death rate is now starting to surge about 10 to 14 days behind case surge. Now, you hear a lot about herd immunity. Let me just briefly comment on what that is. So on the far left of the screen, You've got different kinds of people represented by red and white little octagons. None of us worldwide have any immunity to this. We are completely globally naive immunologically to this virus. So the virus enters into your bubble, your community, your workplace, whatever it is. Some people get infected in the gray, and if they survive, have immunity for some period of time. And as that goes on, you have immunity in a large enough percent of the population that herd immunity takes hold, which means that it's unlikely that the virus can continue its spread because there are not enough susceptibles. We don't know what that threshold is. It's been estimated to be in the 50 to 80%. I think we're going to find it to be somewhere in the 60 to 70%. Here's the problem. The presupposition behind herd immunity is that once you're immune, you stay immune. And that quite obviously is not happening with this virus. So implications of these slides are that we locked down too late and we reopened too early. The infection fatality rate, so if you get infected at the population level, what's the chance you're going to die? It's somewhere around 1%. Okay, that's about 10-fold higher than for influenza. All right, let me just make the point that the highest risk group of people are people 65 and older, and at best, we get 50% of them to take the flu vaccine. So what's going to happen with a disease that has an infection fatality rate 10-fold higher than flu when we do end up with vaccines? The case fatality rate has varied between 0.7 in Germany and 9.3 in Italy. When you adjust that, I saw Mike and Judy there briefly, so I have to say that. When you adjust that for population structure, it comes down to about 2%. It's very likely that the actual caseload in the US is probably 10-fold higher than what has been reported. And the reason for that has been the relative lack of testing, particularly early on. And the fact, as I mentioned, that many people have not been tested because they're asymptomatic. They don't have any reason to be tested. And we make silly rules like saying we're only going to test people if they have symptoms. So it's functionally saying, well, we're not going to find out about half or more of the cases. And of course, and I'm talking nationally here, we have no cohesive testing, tracing, or pandemic preparedness offensive posture here. It reminds me a lot of a sentence that I have memorized from the executive report of the 9/11 Commission. They said this: "We believe the fundamental problem was one of imaginability. Though we had been warned many times, because we could not imagine it, we failed to prepare for it." And I'm going to hopefully make the case to you today that we could, in subsequent years, when we have the COVID-19 Commission report, we will say, we believe the fundamental problem was one of imaginability. Though 3 novel coronaviruses crossed the species barrier inside of 16 years to infect humans, and an influenza pandemic, so 4 in 16 years, because of denial and lack of imaginability, we failed to prepare for what those of us who work in this field know is going to happen, and going to happen again. We will have a, whatever you want to call it, a COVID-25 at some point, perhaps worse than what we've seen, who knows? So we go through this cycle over and over. I've participated in many national and international tabletop exercises. And though even those of us that do this have difficulty imagining it, most of those end up with dissolution of governments and anarchy. And when you look at the many factors that have happened, look how close in some regards we came to that. Typically what happens is that governments and individuals deny the problem, then they recognize it and panic. Then the worst thing that can happen in a pandemic is fleeing. hoarding, we've seen this, then touting miracle cures, then a search for the guilty so that we have a scapegoat, finally acceptance, hopefully response, always contaminated by conflicts of interest, and eventually recovery. Well, this is why masks are being pushed so hard. So this is a cartoon of a compilation of the best models that I know of. When you hear 6 feet, that's magical thinking, okay? That's reducing complexity to something simple that the sheeple can understand, all right? What I mean by that is, while it's true that the largest droplets tend to fall in the 6 to 10 foot range, the gas cloud, if you will, of the smaller particles, and you all have seen that if you've ever, sneezed in the sunlight, for example, you know that there are particles and then small particles. Those small particles can fan out actually over a diameter of around 26 feet or so before they tend to drop down to the ground out of gravity. So this idea that if I just stay 6 feet away from people, I don't need to wear a mask is false. This idea that 6 feet is a magical protection number, remember the virus has no brain, it cannot measure distance. And the idea that I don't need a mask is again, magical thinking. In fact, and these sorts of ecologic and observational studies have their limitations, but it is striking that when you look at countries and their responses, those countries that culturally accept wearing masks and did things like quarantine, school closures, test and trace programs, they very rapidly flattened down their curve. When you look at countries that could not bear to bring themselves to that, you see the difference in the curve here. And of course, the US surpasses them all and continues to do so. All of us hoping we'll wake up one morning and the virus will have just disappeared. When you look at this country by country, and again, you look at countries from quite a different set of economic development, when they put these basic things into place, like physical distancing, lockdown, mask wearing, they flatten the curve down very quickly, very easily. When you look at the countries that didn't do it, the US, the United Kingdom, at least initially, Sweden, we continue to have our cases grow and grow and grow. Well, George Bernard Shaw said, we learn from history that men never learn anything from history. My wife and daughter did point out he said men. All right, on to the vaccines. Let's talk about that. As you know, we don't have any licensed vaccines. This is an odd thing to say, but as a vaccinologist, it'll be difficult to understand what the regulatory pathway will be in the absence of continuing outbreaks. There are multiple vaccines in development, and the reality, no one wanted to listen to me at the beginning of the outbreak when I said it will be 12 to 18 months, not 6 months. The reality is it will be another 6 months from today, at the earliest, if everything goes right, if no barriers come up, before a vaccine will be available, unless we trade safety for speed. For example, using a compassionate use or emergency use authorization mechanism to release vaccine. We have no known correlate of protection, so we don't know what to measure to say whether you're protected or not. A real issue in coronavirus immunology, and all of you, by the way, have been infected with coronaviruses. There are 4 seasonal coronaviruses that circulate every winter, cause about 30% of colds, as we call them. And immunity to those starts disappearing within 80 days, which is why we get recurrently infected. This was true with SARS, it was true with MERS, it's turning out to be true with SARS-CoV-2. The problem is it's different for different people, and we don't know, because we don't know a level of protection, we don't know how long effective immunity will actually last in a given individual. Now, typically vaccines go through a 3-phase process. It takes between 7 to 20 years, costs about $1 billion or so US. So there's one vaccine that's been approved in China just for the Chinese military. You can figure that one out for yourself. There are 3 to 4 in phase 3 studies, 13 in phase 2, and 19 in phase 1, and then well over 100 in preclinical study. So here is the ideal profile. It would have excellent safety, induce protective immunity, ideally after a single dose, doesn't elicit any immunopathology, long-lasting protection, can be mass-produced, stable at room temperature, stored indefinitely, and ideally doesn't require a highly trained public healthcare provider. We will not meet any of those criteria, perhaps with the exception of the first bullet. We don't really know yet what to look at. Are we looking at prevention of infection? Are we trying to reduce transmission, prevent disease, prevent death, prevent complications, prevent adverse maternal fetal complications? So you begin to appreciate just how complex this is when we are starting, as I like to say, if you're an artist, the canvas that we call COVID-2 was blank, whatever it's been now, 27, 28 weeks ago. It was absolutely blank. And on the one hand, it's a brand new virus to us. On the other hand, it is amazing how many pixels, if you will, have been filled in on that canvas. I spend about 12 to 14 hours a day on COVID now in my laboratory, and I can't keep up with the amount of literature coming out. Now, here's why I say trading speed and safety. If you're looking, so many people are afraid to take flu vaccine, and the major adverse event associated, I won't say caused, but associated with flu vaccine is a risk of Guillain-Barré, of temporary paralysis. That risk is somewhere around 1 in a million, okay? These trials are being powered such that we will only know about adverse events that occur at the rate of 1 in 5,000 or more often. We will not know about adverse events that occur 1 in 7,000 or 10,000 or 100,000 because we simply are not studying large enough numbers of people. And that's actually pretty typical for new vaccine development, not so typical when they are brand new pathogens to us. I published about a month ago an editorial called "The Tortoise and the Hare," a cautionary note pointing this out to vaccinologists that we have some significant data gaps here and we're making presuppositions we're not explicitly acknowledging. So here are the different types of array of vaccine types. They fit into viral vector, genetic or nucleic acid, and protein-based. My laboratory has received funding from an investor, I should point out, where we are developing a peptide-based vaccine, and I'll discuss that later with you. So in a simplified form, let's start at the top left and we'll work our way counterclockwise. So the simplest thing you could do, and there are some companies doing it, is take the virus, heat it, and inject the inactivated virus. We do a lot of vaccines that way, and successfully so. The other thing to do is to attenuate or weaken it. We do that. Measles, mumps, and rubella, the first shingles vaccine, chickenpox vaccine, were all designed that way. Then synthetic and recombinant subunit vaccines, then DNA or RNA-based vaccines, and then on the far right, using viruses or bacteria to infect people, go through one round of reproduction, and then deliver the genetic material that you form an immune response against. So in even more simplified form now, here's what's happening from the left side going to the right. There are inactivated and live attenuated whole virus vaccines that are being studied. There are viral vector and nucleic acid vaccines. Those are the three front runners that you've heard about. And those can be RNA or DNA, replicating or non-replicating. And then our own lab and others developing protein-based vaccines. So let's go through.
Excuse me a second, Doctor. We're bumping up against 1 o'clock, and this is fascinating, and I'm sure people would like to continue. So I guess I would say if you have to leave as a Rotarian, you need to leave the meeting. Great, but we'd like to continue on and have a little bit of time at the end for some questions. So I'm okay with staying on if you want to continue.
Okay, and I don't have too many more slides other than a section on how to protect yourself, which we can not do if time doesn't allow. So I'm just going to go through these kind of rapidly. The scientific details are not as much of a concern, but there's the Moderna vaccine. This is an RNA vaccine. There's the Oxford vaccine, where a chimpanzee virus is being used to infect people, go through one round of amplification, and deliver spike protein. And then another adenovirus, or common cold type virus, also expressing those proteins. So these were all reported Monday. That's how fast this moves. All of them produced decent levels of antibody. That antibody could be boosted. It did take 2 doses, and they had cellular immune responses. So that's all very good news. Our particular approach, if you look right from the bottom and go upwards, you see a little red triangle. That's a piece of the virus that our immune cells thinks is the most important. We've developed a method of seeing what that T cell sees and pulling out those little pieces of virus, and we're going to use that as a vaccine. We've successfully done that with measles, with varicella, and with smallpox. The reason for it is it's inexpensive to make it. You can store them indefinitely. You don't need a cold chain, and a variety of other favorable factors. All right, how do you protect yourself? This, I thought, may be the most interesting to you. Well, here are your biggest risks: not using face masks, not adhering to distancing, inadequate hand washing, COVID fatigue, that is beginning to take shortcuts and making mistakes, and mental health issues. Now, I know there's some surgeons in the group. They are the only group I've ever seen wash their hands properly. I have never seen a layperson wash their hands properly. Never, ever. Here's the behavioral problem. Everyone thinks they know how to. So go to YouTube later, search for Dr. Poland and Jimmy Kimmel. I did a skit on his show, and you'll never forget how to wash your hands properly. Does wearing a mask help? This has become a political, religious, cultural issue when it needn't be. The simple fact is that wearing face masks help. There's no question about it. Every group, every school, every country, every workplace that has instituted these measures have seen their case rate fall dramatically. It's not magic. It's simple, basic epidemiology. It works. And it protects against large respiratory droplets. It's a behavioral aid not to touch your nose, mouth, or eyes. And I hear this all the time, but I can't wear a mask. Yes, you can. We wear them all day long. My daughter-in-law she's a nurse. She left her job here and flew to New York and worked for 10 weeks in a COVID hospital. This is a coworker. This is what those people went through because we can't get people to wear masks and stay home. I won't go through the detail of face masks unless questions. Again, let me just say that washing your hands with soap is the best thing you can do. Hand sanitizers are second best. They have to be alcohol-based. It doesn't work well if your hands are visibly soiled or you have mucus on them because you've coughed or sneezed. So I'm going to sum up with a couple of slides. This is the nature of human behavior. First, denial. Fear and ignorance turn out to be the most highly transmissible diseases known in humans. Overpromising, the inability to develop common protocols and policies, and funding, which only lasts as long as the human attention span. So some cautions: there is immense public and governmental pressure for treatment and vaccines that has badly misled people. There is no substitute for careful clinical studies and trials. We have done science by press release in this country. We have overvalued case reports, which are merely anecdotes, and the plural of anecdote is not data. And our job as physicians and scientists is to help, not harm. So the truth is, we've had 3 novel coronaviruses cross the species barrier in the last 16 years. We've already had our first influenza pandemic. We have a squirrel positive for bubonic plague in Colorado. We have a new swine flu virus that's just been identified in China, and a 2-year-old in Germany has been infected with it already. We have no excuse for not being ready, prepared, and in sync. Some have prepared well. I'm proud of my own institution. Mayo prepared very, very well. You are the beneficiaries of that. Other institutions did too, but many did not and are suffering mightily for it. I'll end the way I began with a quote from Camus. I am not an existentialist, but I thought his quote fit. Everybody knows that pestilences have a way of recurring in the world, yet somehow we find it hard to believe in ones that crash down on our heads from a blue sky. There have been as many plagues as wars in history, yet always plagues and wars take people equally by surprise. So I will end there, and I am free to stay if there are questions that you have. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Poland. There are a few questions that have been posted. If you have other questions, please put them on the chat line. Phil asks, is the greater risk to people of increasing age due to increasing numbers of underlying health problem, or an increasing inability of older people's immune systems to respond?
It's a great question, and the answer is both. On the one hand, we undergo what's called immunosenescence, and it's interesting how that works. You become immunosenescent in terms of human papillomavirus vaccine by the age of 40, and for most vaccines by the age of 65, which I am facing. I got my Medicare card to start next month. It is a how did it happen so fast? Maybe some of you can tell me. And then of course, so you don't handle the virus well, and then because these viruses manifest their pathology in end organs, which are now compromised by age, that's why you have the death in the severe cases.
Good, thank you. Barry asked a question. The federal government has purchased millions of vaccine dosages from Pfizer. At what point would you personally advise taking the vaccine?
Yeah, this is, I think is going to be, I'm just writing an editorial now because we are about to embark on an experiment we have never done in human history. We are going to release very quickly 3, 4, 5, 6 vaccines in succession in the midst of a pandemic. We have never, ever done that before. And I think it's going to cause massive confusion for providers, healthcare systems, patients, as they struggle to think which vaccine is the best for me. In addition, I think it's going to take a certain value judgment. How concerned are you? And based on what happens as we get to winter time when the vaccines become available, what's happening with the virus? Has it mutated and gotten worse? Has it dampened down where we don't need to worry about it as much? that will have an effect on my own decision making. But I personally will not take one until phase 3 clinical trials are done and they are published so that they can be peer reviewed and us understand what was the target of immunity, what was the safety profile, and what data do we have on the duration of that immunity.
Great. Christine Erke made a comment, and I assume it's on this same subject, great skit on Jimmy Kimmel.
Thank you.
He has done something that sort of reflects in a hopefully a humorous, but probably a bit sarcastic manner, some of these issues. Doug asked the question, what did Mayo do to react to this?
Yes, well, yeah, I can unabashedly beam. I don't know what to say. I'm every organization has its foibles, but I will say in complete transparency, I think Mayo did a fabulous job in responding to this. We had our PPE and supply chain in order. We had policies and procedures. Mayo has funded a group who for the last 10 years, actually more like 11 or 12 years now, has been preparing for an event like this. And as seamlessly as you can when it's something new, if it had been an influenza pandemic, it would have gone even more smoothly. But, we are literally, so to speak, flying the airplane while we're building it. And taking that into account, I think Mayo has just done a fabulous job.
Kind of follow up on that, do we know what type of vaccine that the Chinese are using in their military? And
yes, they used they did not use a genetic vaccine. And what's interesting about it is they only did, I think, a phase 1 or 2 study. And then, I mean, as you can in China say, you will get this vaccine. And they got the vaccine. But what's interesting to me is that their very first instinct was to immunize their military, not their populace, not the older people at highest risk, not their physicians and first responders, but their military.
Interesting. I do have a question. As we move forward, and obviously the discussion has been that we may have a second round or a spike, and in conjunction with the normal influenza outbreak. Are the precautions that we are taking for this pandemic and the hand washing and the masks and so on, are they appropriate for these other type of protections as well? I mean,
yes, they are. And let me make a couple of comments about that, because I know how hard this is. I am deeply empathetic, particularly for people that have medical problems or that are older. This is a frightening virus. I won't whitewash it. It's a frightening virus, and you just have to take precautions, and the tendency is to grow weary of these precautions. I would guard against doing that. Here's the way I explain it to people. The term I used is contextually appropriate layers of protection, okay? If you're out in your cabin in rural South Dakota and there's nobody there, you don't need to take any precautions. But if you're in Rochester, where we still have cases, it's been dampened down pretty well, you need to take precautions. Now, if you're, what would those be? Well, no one of them is by themselves 100% effective. So what you're trying to do, and let me make the analogy with your car. You have, the way you're safe in your car is you have good tires, your car's in good repair, you have brakes, you have a seat belt, you have airbags, and that combination of things keeps you safe. No one of them perfectly, but together they do. These what are called non-pharmaceutical interventions are much the same way. Hand sanitizing, mask wearing when you're out in public, and distancing are very, very powerful. When you reliably do that, it would be difficult to get infected.
Mhm. Thank you. But I'm going to try to wrap this up, I guess, because we want to respect everybody's time, especially the doctors. The last question here, and I would point out too that Elizabeth will post this to our Facebook page, so the presentation will be available as well on that. But
and Christopher, I don't have another appointment till 3, so I am happy to stay on if there are those who have questions. I mean, that's what we do as physicians, right? We try to help.
Yeah, well, I appreciate that. So if you do have time, well, here's the most recent question from Phil. What is your sense of how this will pan out, say 2 or 3 years down the road?
Well, the big boogeyman is whether this virus is going to change over time, much like influenza viruses do. It doesn't appear to change as rapidly as flu does. My guess is that it could well become an endemic, ongoing virus, much like influenza does, much like the seasonal coronaviruses do. It is unbelievable to me the speed at which science is occurring in regard to this virus. So the key will be developing a vaccine or a series of vaccines that induce really high levels of protective immunity, particularly in those of us, and I'm now in the ranks, 65 and older, so that we have durable immunity, and that will be what we're spending full time on to try to achieve. Somebody had asked the question about the U.S. buying, lots of doses. What is uncertain right now is how many doses we'll have in what time frame and how they will be allocated. We have typically done things using what's called a utilitarian ethic. In other words, it goes to those who are at highest risk. As you know, with this country facing systemic racism and other issues, the move is toward an egalitarian ethic. In other words, maybe what it should be is those who suffer the most should be first in line. For example, older adults, members of minority communities, etc.
All right. Someone asked, Doug asked, anti-malarial drug I took in the Army in Vietnam, was that useful and ethical?
It was for malaria, but not for COVID. And there's just, generations to come, I think are gonna laugh and smirk that this ever caught on and was touted from the highest pulpits, so to speak, in the land, absent having clinical data to suggest that it was helpful. Fear can be helpful. Panic is not helpful. And that's what we've experienced. Everybody's looking for a magic bullet, and we don't have a magic bullet right now. But what we do have is highly efficacious series of interventions that, if people will accept and do, work.
So in that context, you showed a slide where the eastern, New York, Vermont, Connecticut, I believe, maybe New Hampshire, whatever, have flattened the curve significantly. What have they done that we aren't doing, other than following, perhaps not following the opening of all of these public venues and so on?
Well, you just put your finger on it, and that's exactly right. They had a lockdown, mandatory masks, and I know those policies have varied over time by state, but they moved to mask wearing. Their public policy was metric driven. I don't mean to be political here, but for example, the governor of New York, I think once they got it, they really managed it well with metrics. and phased their opening based on that. They didn't do so well in the beginning of this, but they did catch on. You know, it's interesting to me that despite all the efficacy of face masks, you're hearing about states announcing this week, we're going to mandate it Monday. Okay, in 5 days, when you have a virus that spreads exponentially, there are people among us today who won't be here 2 weeks from now because of that.
It's interesting that in the state of New York, which is notoriously antagonistic to following rules, that they've actually followed the rules, and it worked.
You know, I think what happens, and we see this with influenza, measles, everything else, it's why I have no hair. I've pulled it all out. It literally seems that neighborhood by neighborhood or school by school, a tragedy has to happen before people's deniability is stripped away and they take it seriously. We have people in this culture who think this is a hoax.
Yeah.
They really do. And so, no, they're not going to accept masks. I think in New York, when they saw that in the second decade of the 21st century, Americans were digging pits on Riker Islands to handle the bodies, I think your deniability tends to, you know, fall away.
Exactly. Well, I think I've kind of reached the end of the questions here. Dr. Poland, your presentation is very informative, very eye-opening, and we really do appreciate your
Thank you.
presenting to us and taking the time to be with us today.
Thank
as an honorarium in your name, we typically, in my year at least, are putting a contribution in your name to one of 5 local not charities, but institutions, the public library, the Boys and Girls Club, Jeremiah program, the First Steps, or Cradle to Career. And Elizabeth will ask you to pick one of those sometime.
Elizabeth, if you would just give me a sentence or two, the last 3 I'm not familiar with, and be happy to do that. Blessings on all of you. If there's been any silver lining during this this time, I have finally done what, I see George and Dorothy Allen there too. Blessings on you guys. I have finally been able to do something I've longed to do. I'm now in my last year of seminary. And so it's been a silver lining for me, and I just want to leave you all with blessings and best wishes for good health. I know some of you have really difficult and desperate questions, and I'd be happy, perhaps Barry has my email and of course my Mayo email. I'm happy to try to answer those and help people think through things for their family and for their well-being.
Well, thank you, Doctor. We really appreciate your presentation. So as we close, I want to thank everyone for joining us today, and hope that you have a safe and productive week ahead. As we adjourn, please go and serve, and remember, Rotary opens opportunities. Well, thank you all.